Hello everyone, I'm your instructor Daniel Steele, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. In this lecture, I'm going to talk to you about liberalism and public health. This lecture will cover the RACI reading from week 4. So let's dive right in. So first of all, liberalism. What is that? Liberalism is a political philosophy. Political philosophies are general theories about how society should be organized and arranged and how the different parts of society should relate to one another. And so liberalism is a political philosophy that takes individual freedom to be the key moral driving value. And so liberalism tends to oppose government interference in individual choices in many different spheres. So important freedoms in liberalism include things like free speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and free markets. Liberalism originally came about or emerged in Europe in the 17th century in opposition to aristocracy. So if you think of the French Revolution, as in this image up on the slide, one of the ideas of the French Revolution was, liberté, égalité, fraternité. These were, the idea that all people were equal and there shouldn't be some class of aristocrats who ruled over everybody else. In more modern times, liberalism became a sort of predominant political philosophy in post-World War II Anglo-American countries, really in reaction to totalitarianism, such as fascism during World War II and communism during the Cold War era. So liberalism and public health have a kind of complex relationship with one another. In particular, liberalism and public health can often seem to come into sort of conflict because liberalism's emphasis on individual freedom can conflict with interventions to promote population health. But in the reading by RACI for this week, RACI argues that in fact, liberalism is compatible with most public health actions. And so what I'm going to be doing in this lecture is explaining how that's so. How is it that, according to RACI, liberalism is compatible with most of the things public health wants to do, and RACI wants to argue that in the places where it's maybe not compatible, public health should reconsider whether it should do those things. Okay, so to understand how liberalism and public health can kind of peacefully coexist, it's important to keep in mind that liberalism is not the same thing as anarchy. That is to say, liberalism in all of its different forms and versions, and we'll learn about some of the differences of some of them today in this lecture, but in every different version of liberalism, they always agree that the government can be justified in some circumstances in restricting individual freedoms. The question is simply when and sort of to what extent the government can do this. So there are two main principles that liberals have proposed about this issue. When can the government restrict freedom of individuals, that we're going to talk about today. One of these we've already encountered, the harm principle. We've already looked at that. And a new one for this class will be the equal liberty principle. So the harm principle, I'll be quick here since we've talked about this one before, but the only legitimate reason for the government to restrict an individual's liberty is to prevent harm to others. The harms are usually thought of as being direct, like hitting somebody or maybe coughing on somebody and infecting them with a disease. As we've discussed before, what counts as a harm to another person that can justify state intervention is something that's not always totally clear, but the harm principle is usually understood as being a fairly direct kind of harm. The harm principle is endorsed by what's sometimes called classical liberalism or libertarianism in more modern times. And libertarians usually just see the idea that the government should protect private property, it should prevent crime, it should prevent people from murdering and stealing from each other and things like that. But it shouldn't be doing a whole lot beyond that. It shouldn't, for example, be trying to redistribute wealth, for instance, which we'll talk about next. So the equal liberty principle. This is another principle that liberals sometimes invoke as a reason for why the government can be justified in interfering with freedom. And here the idea is that everyone should have as much freedom as is compatible with similar freedom for others. In the words of John Rawls, who's cited in the RACI reading, each person is to have the right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties that is compatible with a similar scheme for others. And this is a type of idea that's associated with what's often thought of as left liberalism. And if you think of, say, like the Liberal Party of Canada, it's kind of more like left liberalism than it is like libertarianism. So what's distinctive about this idea? Well, what's different about this idea, if you think about it in comparison to the harm principle, is that equal liberty can restrict freedom in cases where there isn't an obvious direct harm to anybody else. And examples of this can occur with something you might think of as opportunity hoarding, when advantaged individuals act in ways that sort of crowd out the freedom of people who have less advantages. So one example that Rawls talked about was unrestricted donations to political campaigns. His idea was, well, this results in a loss of equal freedom to participate in the political process because the wealthy people just end up dominating the whole thing. The politicians only really pay attention to the interests of the wealthy people because they're the ones who pay for their campaigns. And that just that sort of crowds everybody else out of this process. And so that results in not everybody having this sort of equal freedom. And that means, in Rawls's view, it was legitimate and justifiable for the government to intervene and for restrict the campaign donations and so on to allow for equal political participation. An example that would be familiar to everyone who lives in Vancouver: wealthy buyers pricing everyone else out of the housing market. This is another case where you don't directly harm somebody if you're someone who's very wealthy, and by paying $5-6 million for a house, you're not directly hurting anyone by doing that. In fact, maybe you're helping the person who's selling the house to you. They're very happy to get all this money for it. But if many people do this, it drives the price of housing up so much that most people can't afford to have a place to live. And this, again, according to the equal liberty principle, could be viewed as something that can justify state intervention. So if we compare the harm and equal liberty principles, both agree that the government can restrict individual freedom to prevent theft or physical harm to others. So of course, if one person attacks another person, that's obviously not going to be compatible with either the equal liberty principle or the harm principle. Both are skeptical of paternalism. And this is something we'll talk about more in just a bit. Paternalism is government restrictions on freedom for the person's own good. But the key difference is that the equal liberty principle can justify government policies that redistribute wealth to support equal opportunities. And these are things like public education, if you have social subsidized housing, if you have a publicly funded healthcare system. These would all be situations where the government redistributes wealth through taxation to a progressive taxation system, such that people who are wealthier tend to pay more taxes, and then this money is used to make sure that these essential opportunities are attainable on a reasonably equal basis. So Racy's main point is that given these two ideas, the harm principle and the equal liberty principle, they can be used to justify many types of public health interventions. Most types of public health interventions, he thinks, can be justified on the basis of one or both of these principles. So if we start with quarantine of an infected person during a pandemic, it would depend on the circumstances, but potentially if there's a serious risk of harm to others, and for example, there's no treatment or vaccine, then this might be justified from a liberal perspective on the basis of the harm principle. A similar point about the harm principle could be applied to smoking bans in public places. And if we think of equal liberty and government interventions, again, we can see, of course, social justice is often seen as a core component of public health. But Racy thinks, contrary to critics, that liberalism can explain how this is so. The idea that the government has an obligation under a sort of left liberal perspective to sort of intervene in society to sort of equal out opportunities so that wealthy people can't just sort of monopolize everything and not leave anything for anybody else, and have things like public education, publicly funded healthcare, et cetera, and things like supplemental nutrition assistance programs is an example that Racy mentions, that these are all justifiable under a sort of left liberal perspective. Now let's return to the idea of paternalism. As noted, this is something that all types of liberalism tend to be skeptical of. But it turns out that paternalism can come in many different shapes and sizes, and whether it can be justified according to liberalism can depend on the type of paternalism that it is. And so Racy distinguishes between soft and hard paternalism. And soft paternalism is preventing someone from involuntarily making a choice that is bad for them, but which doesn't affect others. So examples of soft paternalism can occur when you're talking about, say, people are too young to really understand the risks that they're taking. For example, by being on their cell phones 20 out of 24 hours of the day, or by smoking or doing other things that are going to have long-term harmful effects to them. In such cases, according to Racy, liberalism can justify interventions. Hard paternalism, on the other hand, is preventing someone from voluntarily making a choice that is bad for them. And so here the key issue is somebody knows the risks. They understand the risks of smoking, for example. They understand the risks of skiing or rock climbing, but they want to do it anyway. In this kind of situation, it's more difficult to justify paternalism from a liberal perspective. And so Racy argues, for example, that cigarette taxes are a kind of soft paternalism because people who smoke often do so without really truly grasping the risks of it. And so things like taxes, plain packaging, and so on, he thinks can be justified as a type of soft paternalism. Finally, Racy considers the objection that liberalism can't really capture key ideas in public health because it doesn't focus sufficiently on the common good. And the idea being that if you think of public health, we're concerned with the health of the population. And so liberalism is so focused on the rights of the individuals that it can't adequately capture this core element of public health. So Racy has two lines of response to this type of objection. And the first is to suggest that, in fact, left liberalism can capture some important aspects of a notion of the collective or common good. And it does this through this sort of left liberal approach to emphasizing equal opportunity and redistributing resources to benefit those who are the least well off, so that everyone can have sort of a decent shot at life. And so Racy's idea is that, well, if you think of, we want a society where everybody ideally has a good opportunity at life, that's a conception of a public good. That's a conception of the common good for society. So it's not true, according to Racy, to criticize liberalism on the grounds that it only cares about individuals. In addition, Racy argues that if you try to go farther than this, the idea of redistributing wealth to ensure everyone gets a good shot at life, then you start to go sort of too far. And if you go beyond what liberalism could justify, Racy suggests, then you sort of really go into a realm where the government is trying to tell people what a good life should be, tell them how to live their lives in ways that are morally problematic. And this is related to an idea that's sometimes called state perfectionism. State perfectionism occurs when the government attempts to try to force a particular view of the good life, of how people should live, on the population. Classic examples of problematic state perfectionism from a liberal point of view would be having a state religion, where the government tries to force everyone to, say, be Christian or something like that. From a liberal point of view, that's the sort of thing the government should not be doing. People should be free to decide what religion, if any, they want to have. In the same way, Racy thinks that trying to ban meat, for example, because of harmful health effects or harmful environmental effects, would be an example of the government sort of overreaching and trying to impose a vision of the good life on people in a way that would be unjustified, sort of analogous to the government trying to promote a particular religion, for instance. So we'll talk about this example about meat prohibition and about whether, or more generally about regulations intended to discourage meat consumption, and whether they are justifiable from a liberal perspective in class. But for now, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you soon. Goodbye.